I don't know if I would say that doubt is a good thing or that we should even lean into doubt. I'm not even sure if I would say doubt is necessary, but I do think doubt is inevitable. It's just we're going to doubt.
Yeah.
And I think what is necessary is to make room for that, especially the church. If the church makes room for that, then it lets us know that we're not alone in our doubt. If the church tries to cling to certainty and preach certainty and you need to know that you know that you know, and we're left alone in our doubt. And I think that's when we really, really struggle.
Hi, welcome to Penitent Thieves with Josh Mumby, and today we're having a conversation with Joe Welch, the host of the podcast My Journey Back to God. Like me, Joe grew up in the conservative holiness movement, which is a small-ish collection of church denominations that tend to emphasize modesty and holy living. This podcast isn't really about that, though. For greater clarification on this religious movement, I did an episode about it not too long ago, so it'll be the first link in the description if you're interested. But in this episode, if you haven't already read the title, Joe is currently not Christian. In 2021, he publicly denounced his faith, and for a while, he was an atheist. This, of course, made waves in our small corner of the world, and he's been very publicly deconstructing/reconciling his beliefs. However, he's now come to a point where he is agnostic with the hope of Christianity being true. So, in this episode, we're going to be talking about Joe's departure from Christianity, doubt, people's reaction to it, and now his journey back, possibly to God, but he's not yet sure. So, with that out of the way, enjoy the show, and God bless. One of my friends actually mentioned you, I think it was sometime last year. You know, he was like, hey, remember so-and-so, from school? Her dad is like going through this sort of like phase or whatnot. And the way he phrased it was as if almost like you're like the boogeyman a little bit. Does that make sense? Where it's like you observe from afar, but you don't engage with it because it's really scary. Do you feel like people kind of have a reaction like that?
Yeah, I've had either parents of my friends who are my age or parents of like younger people that I know that are maybe my daughter's age, a little bit older than my daughter. Like their parents have started following me just to sort of keep tabs on what their kids are being exposed to. And when I say kids, again, I'm talking about even people my age. You know, their parents would follow me some just to kind of keep track on, you know, how I'm influencing people in a bad way or whatever. Which is not my intention at all. I think at first, you know, I was really, really angry, but it's not my intention at all to lead anyone away. It's just my journey has been kind of public, which is odd because I've been a fairly private person for most of my life, or at least my adult life. But I feel like, you know, getting back to, you know, those people who were closest to me and should have been there for me in my most difficult moments when they weren't there for me, that kind of led me to reach out in a more public way just because I had no one else to talk to.
Does it feel like people don't want to, like, especially those who are close, don't want to engage with maybe some of the questions you're asking because there's that fear of, oh, what if he has a point and I am convinced of these two?
Yeah, that's really interesting you'd say that because I was really trying to bring one person in particular into my journey, someone who was close to me, and I really wanted their support. And I was inviting them to listen to some of the things I was listening to. I'm like, how do you make sense of these things? And they were really, really hesitant to listen to some of it.
I see.
And whenever I finally was able to get them to listen to some of it, they sort of dismissed it right away. And it's like, oh yeah, you know, I was worried that was going to shake my faith, but you know, I'm just not convinced by their arguments. And they sort of kind of brushed it off as if it was like this thing they were kind of afraid of. And then once they had like a little taste of it, they're like, oh yeah, it doesn't bother me. And sort of this kind of avoidant type of way. It wasn't really that they had sufficient answers. It was more of kind of, I'm just trying to avoid that. So I'm trying to say, oh yeah, that didn't faze me.
Is it like going to an Indian restaurant and like ordering the spiciest level just so you're like, no, see, I'm fine. I was okay. But then you're not actually engaging with the flavor of it.
Yeah, yeah. And they like barely touch it to their tongue, and you're like, yeah, I can tolerate that.
Yeah, I can handle it. Yeah, I can handle that. Yeah, that's not bad.
It's a good analogy.
Yeah. That's what it was like. Yeah. I have had a few other people like try to engage, and I appreciate their efforts and their sincerity. But I don't think that they've questioned things as deeply as I've questioned some things and sought out answers as much as I have. And so, I can tell that in the way that they're asking some of the questions. And then whenever I give a response, they sort of just back down, knowing that, I've already thought through a lot of those questions.
So this is the only example for me that comes to mind, like a practical one that I've had recently, but it's different. But like, so we converted to Eastern Orthodoxy, which it's not, so we're not Protestant, but most of our Christian friends are Protestant. So when I've had conversations with friends of mine who like, they're curious about it, they'll engage if the assumption is that I don't really know, like the reason why we converted was for like emotional reasons and I don't really know what I'm talking about. But when they like learned that I kind of knew what I was talking about, they don't really want to engage in it anymore. Yeah. Because then it's a little intimidating,
I think it's really awkward as well.
Yeah, it gets awkward.
There's this kind of, I don't know, there's this like fear of seeing I guess our experiencing inadequacies that Protestantism had for us. And then it's really awkward engaging in such a conversation with other people because you don't want to make them feel like they're on the wrong path or something.
Yeah, like a lot of conversations, a lot of it was either like trying to make sure we weren't like too Catholic or something. So they're like trying to see if we weren't crazy or if it was I don't know if you've had this in your sort of experience where they're just asking to see like,
does this line up with what
does it line up with what they want to see? You know what I'm saying?
That makes sense.
Yeah, I think some, especially as I re-explore Christianity, I think it's easier for them to engage with if I just say, yeah, I don't believe, or, I'm not a Christian anymore. But if I say, yeah, I'm kind of thinking of this version of Christianity, I've almost had this feeling that some people would rather me just remain atheist instead of converting to Catholicism or something. Because it's like, I think that a lot of Protestant Christians are very suspicious of other Christians. They sort of view the other Christians as the enemy. They're like the world is the wolf and they're not trying to hide. Whereas other Christians whose theology is wrong or whatever, they're kind of the wolf hiding in sheep's clothing. They're the deceitful ones that you just can't trust. And so as I've re-explored Christianity, people are really concerned about my beliefs at that point and what I'm considering.
It's got to be kind of difficult, especially when you're trying to find answers and then bounce them off with other people, and then they're just like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Do
you ever feel like, you know who Jordan Peterson is?
Yeah.
You ever feel like, because he like sort of like dabbles into like Christian stuff a lot.
Yeah.
And it feels like a lot of American Christians are just kind of like waiting for the day that becomes Christian, but not, sometimes it doesn't feel like they really care about, like his like soul or anything. A lot of it seems like we want like a guy with his brain on our side. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because like Ravi Zacharias didn't pan out very well, so we need like another, really smart guy.
Yeah.
But it like, but sometimes it feels like I don't know if you've experienced this, but people just kind of check in on you just to see, okay, is he there yet? Okay, never mind. And then he's coming back for when he's, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Do you feel like that sometimes?
I would say some recently,
Mhm.
but my journey was like I fell away from the faith pretty hard. I felt like I was an atheist. Um, and then I've slowly kind of been working my way back. So I think a lot of people, when they first started to see my journey, they just kind of checked out. Like, this guy's off the deep end. We're checking out. Um, but yeah, now that I've begun to ask or began to look at Christianity again more seriously, I do sense that sometimes people will check in like, oh, what's he saying now? Nope, he's not quite there yet. So
Mhm.
I'm gonna check out and check in maybe in a month or two.
Mhm.
So, what kickstarted this journey back to Christianity?
Ah, well, it might be easier to start with why I left Christianity in the first place.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Because I would say I was going through a pretty intense emotional storm whenever I first left. And now that that's starting to subside, it's allowing me to kind of assess things from from less of a place of wounding and pain.
I see.
So I can kind of think through things a little better. Um, I'm less like um, offended by Christianity, I guess maybe is the right way of saying that. I'm less offended by it, so I feel more open to just thinking about it and talking about it again.
Mhm.
So I don't want to go into a ton of detail as far as why I left the faith, but for me, it had to do with, um, I thought I knew who I was, and I thought I knew who my dad was, and I thought I knew what our relationship was. And some things happened in 2019 that made me realize there was a lot of, there was a lack of self-awareness, like a deep lack of self-awareness of of mainly things having to do with like suppressed grief um, around my mom's death. So my mom died right before I turned 12. Um, and some things happened afterwards, like we moved on pretty quickly, and I never really got a chance to grieve. And so there's a lot of suppressed grief that I wasn't aware of. I just thought I was kind of, I thought I was emotionally strong, and really I was just emotionally numb. And I had sort of cut off pieces of myself that I really needed to engage with and just never did. And what happened in 2019 made me realize that one of the reasons why I never spoke out about my grief was because I just wasn't allowed. Um, I knew that the response I would get would be one of like shaming and condemning, and so I just kept quiet, moved on, and got to a point where I convinced myself that I didn't really feel a lot of that grief. I didn't need to feel any of it. Um, and so I tried to speak up about some of that in 2019 after over 20 years of being silent. And the response I got was, you're being so disrespectful, you're being childish. Um, you're treating me as if, you don't love me. And, my dad was saying like, you're making me feel as if it was me that you wished would have died instead of your mom. Um, and then followed by these month-long periods of just silence. And I thought that my dad and I were very close. And then to realize that, I made this post a while back on Facebook where I'm not sure if many people realized it was in reference to my dad, but he told me in that moment, I told him like, I have this pain that I'm just wanting to share with you, and I feel like you don't care. Um, And he said, I would die for you. And so I made this post a while back on Facebook that said, you know, I know you'll die for me, but would you hold me when I cry? And that was something that my dad couldn't offer me. And I didn't realize that was the case. I thought I never spoke about my grief because it's just who I was and it was my personality. Um, and was actually talking about some things with a CHM leader. It's someone who most people would know. We were doing small groups in their house every Tuesday night, and I only say that there was someone who was well respected in the CHM community, and I only say that because they recommended me to go to a counselor, and so I went to the counselor that they recommended. Um, and a lot of times when I tell people that I went to see a counselor, they think, oh, this new age person probably got your mind all twisted, and that's why you're on this journey. But it was someone who, is well respected within the CHM who recommended that I go see this person. So it wasn't, this new age kind of person. In fact, several people within the CHM have referred people to the same counseling group. And they sort of helped me realize how much I was burying of my own emotions. And one thing that my counselor told me was, he asked me, why haven't you ever spoken up about your grief? And I said, well, it's just who I am. I don't need to talk about it. It doesn't bother me. And he's like, that's not normal. There's something wrong there. Something must have happened to have made you afraid to speak out or feel like you couldn't speak out. And I just couldn't go there with him. I became very defensive of my dad. But yeah, whenever I ended up confronting him and he responded that way, it sort of pulled back the curtain on a lot of things that I had never seen before. And it left me feeling very confused. Made me feel like he didn't care about me, didn't care about my pain, my emotions. And so naturally I turned to God, and I realized very quickly that I felt as if God was responding in the very same way. God just didn't care. He was sort of pulling back in disappointment and made me feel as if, once you straighten up, once you get your act together again and you come to me with respect, then I'll meet you where you need me to meet you. But in your broken condition where you're at right now, I don't want anything to do with you. Like, that's how I felt God was responding to me. And I was just questioning everything. Like, I couldn't figure out what was going on. I reached this pivotal moment where I said, you know what? I don't know what's real. I don't know what's true. I don't know who God is. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to dive into the Bible, and whatever God the Bible presents to me, that's the God I'm going to believe in. Because I felt like, the Bible's true. So I'm going to study it. And whatever it tells me about God, and if it tells me that God's this distant God who doesn't really care about us, then I'm just going to have to deal with that and get myself into shape, present myself, get myself back to a place where God would love me and accept me again. And so I began to dive into the Bible, started to have a lot of questions, started looking things up, and I ran across the world of apologetics. And of course, with apologetics, you end up running across counter apologetics. And suddenly I'm extremely confused. So I start listening to these guys, and I stumble across Bart Ehrman. I don't know if you've heard of Bart Ehrman, but I read a few of his books. Yeah, so I read a few of his books, and then I ended up reading How Jesus Became God. And that was sort of like the last straw for me. But really, what became the last straw really is I started to reach out to some people with my doubt, and I was sort of cut off, and I became angry, and that's when I reached out to my childhood pastor, who had been my pastor for over half my life, and he never responded. And that was kind of the last straw for me. And then this was happening in 2020. And so you have like the Trump election going on. There was a lot of tension around police brutality. And I'm following this and seeing how Christians are responding to this. CHM Christians, the ones who are supposed to be the ones who are closest to God and have things right more than anyone else. And they're responding with such hatred, um, uncaring, unloving. And Christianity suddenly seemed very, very ugly to me. And I was like, I want nothing to do with that. I was done. On April of 2021, I publicly renounced my faith, said I'm done with this, And I was very angry for a long time. But as I found people to listen to me and just hear me out, and to see me for who I was and all of my brokenness, and to stay with me, it's that storm slowly started to calm down. And then as those emotions began to calm down, I began to feel, I guess, lonely without God. And it was an odd feeling because one of the first things that I criticized was personal experience. I was like, I would ask people, how do you know any of this is true? Well, I know because God has personally spoken to me about whatever. And like, that's what every other person of faith says. That's what the Jehovah's Witness says, who you say is a cult. That's who what the Mormons say. The Mormons came to my door and they said, we know that if you will pray to God, he'll give you an assurance in your heart that the Book of Mormon is true. That's what they all say. I'm like, your personal experience is so subjective. You can convince yourself of anything. And so it seemed odd to start leaning into wanting Christianity to be true, because of an emotional, like what I wanted to happen was for me to study the truth of it and feel, to come to a place of certainty, like, okay, Christianity is true. I can bank on it. And I just couldn't find that and still haven't been able to find that. But life for me did feel kind of meaningless without God. And so, but I also think that, the reality of what exists without God does not prove God's existence. If God doesn't exist, yeah, the world is meaningless. But if that's the case, then the world's just meaningless. As uncomfortable as that feels, that's just the reality of things. But I guess now I'm leaning more into like hope. I think the Christian position is reasonable. I think there's a lot of good reasons to believe. I don't think there's good enough reasons to feel certain about things in the same way that we're certain that, 2 + 2 = 4, or that I'm holding this pen right here, there's no questions about it. I'm holding this pen. I know you can get into the metaphysical realm that questions really weird things, but, I can know this pen is right here. But I can't know that God's there in the same way that I can know that this pen is here. There's like this element of hope and trust that you just can't get around. If we were certain about it, if we could be as certain as God's existence as I am about this pen, then we wouldn't need faith. We wouldn't need hope. We wouldn't need trust. We would know it as much as we know, that 2 + 2 = 4. And we just don't have that kind of knowledge. Like people will say they know what heaven's like, or they know what hell's like, or they know how God's going to respond to us when we die. And the truth is, no one knows. They don't know. They know what the Bible has to say about it, and they're trusting that the Bible's true. But is that really what's going to happen? The Bible was written by men. And so if Matthew tells us something, we're just trusting Matthew. We're trusting that he told us accurate stuff. We're trusting that Matthew was even the author, right? If Paul says things, we're just trusting Paul. And I don't know if I can trust Paul any more than I can trust, whatever pastor. I think that, yeah, I think we can hope, and we can maybe trust. I don't know, but I don't think we can know certain things. And so opening myself up to, like, I don't have to be certain. I don't have to know. I can, like, lean into hope and maybe even lean into trust. Like, that's what's allowing me to kind of re-explore Christianity from that perspective. Sorry, I just kind of rambled on a bunch there.
Oh, no, it was I found it very interesting. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Did you have thoughts?
Were you going to say something?
I should probably chew on mine for a second and I'll let you go.
I don't know. I was gonna. I do like what you were saying about we can at least lean into hope.
Yeah.
Right. At most. At no point am I trying to. I'm sure you've had enough people try to, like, preach at you. I'm not going to try to do that. I'm not a preacher or anything. But I'm just thinking of it as like the first, like, example in the Bible of the image of God is not, like, just man himself, but man wrapped up in Adam and Eve, so, like, male and female. But that's through, like, marriage. And I was just thinking of, like if someone were to say, like, oh, how do you know that, like, your wife is real? You would kind of go, like, well, I don't know. But you go, but, like, I love her though. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It feels like it's kind of a flaw of the, like, overly rationalistic sort of, like, strain of evangelicalism in the U.S., where it prioritizes sort of, like, the intellectual thinking so much that we sort of forget that, like, the do you know what I'm trying to say?
I think so. Well, first I wanted to say I resonate with your experience quite a bit. I've not had quite the exact same, but just that searching for answers and not really finding what you're, you know what I'm saying, especially from those around you, and that frustration. I've experienced that before. But you would ask me, like, I know what you're trying to say. Mm-hmm. Was it the, God is so, I think the concept of a being that is so outside of humanity, so outside of time, so outside of, like, you know what I'm saying? To be able to create something, like, beyond what our human capacity could do. In some senses, I had to come to a point where I was like, okay, I can't understand God, because every time I've tried to, or every time I felt confident in my understanding of God, I believed something completely incorrect or incoherent about him. And I think what you were saying about there's an element of hope and trust and faith that you kind of have to have. I really had to come to that point to really start gearing my way back to, because I had a falling away as well. Actually, around the same time, like 2020 was kind of my big falling away of Christianity. Realizing that I can't figure it all, and I guess put God into, not saying you're putting him into, like, an exact, like, this is how God should look like, but, like, figuring out, I had to accept that I couldn't rationally fit God into my mind. I think that's kind of what allowed me then to accept, okay, faith is going to have to be part of this. Mm. Was that what you were saying?
I think so. Yeah. Maybe.
Yeah, that's really good. That's actually, I think one of the problems with certainty is that whenever you can make the claim that you have full light. I don't know if you guys remember David Fry's post calling James Planck to apologize. Solomon Schaeffer, who is one of the pastors at the same church that James Planck pastors at, left a comment on David Fry's post and basically said, you have to keep in mind who Planck was talking about. As far as, if they start wearing short sleeves or whatever, then they're backslidden. And he said, these are people who have grown up in the faith, have full light, and have stepped away from truths that they once affirmed. And I don't know, maybe he means something different by full light than what it sounds like. But to think that we have everything figured out, that we have the full light or whatever, that is putting God in this, it's constraining God and limiting God to what we can understand.
Yeah.
And God is, like you said, bigger than that. Like, if God, this is one thing that's helped me lean into it more. Like, if God exists, of course we can't figure God out. It's just too big, too mysterious, too beyond our capacity to figure out. So if I'm feeling confused about God, like, that's probably how I should be thinking of God. Like, I just can't wrap my mind around what or who God is, you know? So yeah, if we reach this point of certainty where we feel like, you know, we know what God's like, we know what, you know, who's going to make it to heaven and who's not, you've actually restricted God down to something we can understand, which is less than what God is if God truly does exist. Yeah, so I like what you said there.
Yeah.
It makes me think of I forget the book, but G.K. Chesterton. I'm going to paraphrase him. Do you know who that is? Chesterton.
I've heard the name. I haven't read any.
Yeah, he's like a late 1800s British Christian writer, but he was talking about like the atheism of that day, the very rationalistic sort of atheism, and he said something like, I'm paraphrasing, but like, it's much easier to stick your head into heaven than heaven into your head. Which I don't know, I like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think there's something to what you guys are saying, where when I was at I'll probably censor the college, but when I was at I had an apologetics class, and it seemed like everyone was talking about like belief in God, like to the extent of like perfect full certainty, like what you're talking about. Like they would talk about it as if there was like no room for doubt whatsoever. And I remember one guy saying something like, if I were to say like a percentage of how much I believe, it's probably like 97%. And then the other 3% is just because I wasn't there for the resurrection. And I just thought, like, this is like a weird kind of like gaslighting sort of weird, I don't know, like environment we had in the room.
Yeah.
And I asked like a question. I said something like, I don't know if I can do that. Like, if I can have that much certainty. And it wasn't like they yelled at me, but it was to the extent of like, I was very harshly like chastised or rebuked by especially the seminary students within.
Yeah, how could you doubt? The Bible's so multiply attested. Like,
yeah,
you just haven't studied enough.
Yeah, and and this isn't me just being like emotionally weak or whatever. Other people were like, "Man, that was ridiculous how they reacted that way."
Yeah,
but yeah, and it seems like there's this huge insistence on a very like intellectual certainty that I don't think we're actually able to attain. And I don't know if this makes sense, but it sounds like you're saying something similar to this, where so the word for faith in the Bible doesn't really mean like, it doesn't mean what we understand faith to mean. Like pistis, the stis part it's like a continual sort of implication. So rather than faith, a better word is like faithing or fidelity or faithfulness. So like, you don't have to like fully believe, you know, to fully love. You know what I'm saying? Like I like, you can love God and be faithful to God without having like full assurance of really anything, you know? Is that what you're kind of something similar to what you're saying?
Yeah, real similar. So I read a book by von Balthasar. I forget his first name, something von Balthasar. The name of the book is Dare We Hope That All Men Be Saved. And in there, he was talking about the difference between hope and wishful thinking. And he said, this is not just wishful thinking. So wishful thinking is like zero possibility of something being true. Like I wish, $1,000,000 would drop on the floor beside me. That's just wishful thinking. But to hope for something, there has to be at least some possibility of it being true.
Mm-hmm.
And so I like to use the analogy of, if you get stranded on an island and the chances of a boat coming by and finding you are pretty slim, but boats do come by every once in a while, and they might maybe see you. Um, so there's a chance, right? And so you can say, okay, well, let's see. The odds of me dying are like 95%, right? And there's only 5% of me surviving. There's only 5% chance this boat's going to come by and see me. So, you know what? I might as well just starve myself to death right now and get it over with. Like, no, there's like 5% chance I might live, right? I'm going to be trying to find some food and trying to find some shelter, and I'm going to be waving that boat down. Like, there's only 5% chance, but I'm trying. I'm hoping, right? Like that 5% chance is enough to keep me alive, to keep me trying, to keep me hoping. Um, and I do think that, if we're looking just at probabilities, I think the probability of Christianity being true is probably more than just 5%, right? I would say, you know, for me personally, maybe somewhere around 50%. I don't know, you know. Um, but using that same analogy, like even if it were only 5 or 10% possible to be true, I think I would rather hope that there's a God who actually loves us than just falling into the 90% possibility of there being no God and everything is completely meaningless. The only meaning is just what I place meaning in myself, which I know some atheists will try to say like that is significant meaning. But for me, yeah, this kind of goes down a totally different path here than certainty. But what about God's existence provides ultimate meaning for us? What is it about God existing that gives us meaning? And I think for a lot of people, it's kind of a selfish thing, and it's this idea that I'm going to live forever. If God's real, I'll live forever. If God's not real, then I'm going to die and it's all going to be over, and nothing I do here even matters. For me, I don't like it. That's what it used to be. Which I think it is for a lot of people, like to contemplate death, lack of existence, like that's difficult. Um, and I was talking to a friend who considers himself a Christian. Most people that I know would not consider him a Christian. He considers himself a Christian. And one thing that he said was, yeah, I'm not really convinced that there's an afterlife. He hopes there is one and sort of believes that there is one, but is not convinced that there is one. And he said what brings him peace is knowing that he would forever be a memory in the mind of God. He's known by God. And once he dies, God will always remember him. It's sort of like my mom. She's gone, right? But she's still alive in a sense because I read her memory is alive. I remember her. I remember all those moments. But when I die, there's no more memories of her even. She's just gone. But if if God exists and God's eternal and there isn't an afterlife, then it brings me peace knowing that I'm known by God and I will always be known by God and I'll always be a memory in his mind. And that was difficult for me to accept at first, but I think I've gotten to a place where I'm at peace with that, so that the meaning that I find in the existence of God isn't about me living forever. It's about me being personally known by this infinite, eternal being, my creator. I'm trying to find more meaning in that, or for that to provide me with more meaning than this idea of living on and existing for all of eternity.
Yeah. When you're talking about being in the like memory of God as sort of like a as like opposed to like an afterlife, it reminds me of one of the main funeral hymns for the Orthodox Church. It's called Memory Eternal, which is like it's not like a too different of an idea, but I think part of that is because they don't envision a world. You ever heard of the idea of a two-story universe? That's probably like Francis Schaeffer idea. Their idea of natural and supernatural is a difference in degree rather than kind. Does that make sense? So like God isn't like, he didn't wind up a clock when he created creation. It's something that he's constantly sustaining so that if we pass on, we are preserved through his memory. Like that's how they would view that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
There still is that belief of an afterlife, but it is weird because that's kind of combined into now. So like in our experience within Orthodoxy, it's like they believe heaven is wherever God is because his presence is there.
Yeah.
And that's really resonated with me because it's like anytime we go into a church service, it's like, oh, I'm stepping into heaven. It's not like maybe the fullness of it, but it is like a glimpse of it. So this idea of, because I stopped thinking about like, where will I go when I die after I
don't think of it either.
After I realized, no, I am existing in the presence of God, not in its fullness, but in the fullness that a human being can be in, if that makes sense. Because like any time in the Bible when God reveals himself, it's like a big deal, you know?
Yeah.
But yeah. And I'm already in heaven, experiencing heaven. I don't know. So I don't feel this disconnect between where God is at and where I am. There's still this level of reverence because there's a recognition of like, no, I am in the presence of the one and only God, but like he's here with us. He chooses to be here with us.
I was going to say something like that too, where I think because like growing up, it's always like, you know, I think a lot of us like got saved because we wanted to avoid hell. You know, I had I took an evangelism class in college, and like 75% of the testimonies of people's salvation story was they were 5 to 7 years old and they went to the altar because the preacher was preaching about hell, and that was one of the things that kind of like got me to go, ooh, this feels like wrong. It feels really messed up. You know, and I feel like we don't think about heaven and hell really at all much. Kind of, but we don't think about like
not in the where will I go when I die?
Yeah, because it's like if you're working within like a Christian framework, it's theologically true. So like when you're baptized into Christ. So it's theologically correct to say that you are currently within the kingdom of God now, but just not fully. So to use like C.S. Lewis language, it'd be more like you'd be going further up and further in. You know what I mean? It's less of a like, it's not all the way over there. It's just more of a progression. But yeah, I don't know.
I was gonna say, oh no, you go ahead. Sorry.
It was just reminding me of C.S. Lewis, especially in his book, The Great Divorce, where hell isn't this separate place away from God. It's this, we're withdrawing more and more from like leaning into being known by God, that we like shrink in size and getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until we like end up let down in like the little tiny cracks of the floor. Like, so like hell is like here. It's just us like retreating deeper and deeper into isolation and loneliness, afraid of being known by God.
Have you read The Last Battle, the final Narnia book?
No, I watched the movies, but I haven't read the books.
Okay. In the final Narnia book, there's like this sort of merging between like Narnia heaven and Narnia earth at the end in the last battle. And there's this whole banquet where even some of the enemies are invited into the banquet. And at the end, there's all these like little goblins sitting around in a circle, like with their arms crossed, pouting. And it's like perfect daylight. And then I think Peter or something is like, hey guys, come on, you're invited too. And they're just like, and they're not wanting to look at them. And he's like, Aslan, what are they doing? They can't hear us. And it's like, no, they don't want to. They don't want to hear you. You know? And I thought that was like a pretty fitting example of like hell, where much of that is what we kind of do to ourselves or do to each other and whatnot, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh no, you're good. Go ahead.
No, I just keep talking and rambling.
No, you're fine. I was gonna say, when it comes to meaning, because that was a huge, like, I guess, pivotal point to why I was like, okay, I need to figure out this Christianity stuff, because I became incredibly nihilistic to where I was just like, okay, I don't know if I want to live anymore, but I'm just like, I know other people around me want me to live, so I got to figure this out. And that was really dark, but going towards like leaning into that hope, leaning into that trust, lost my train of thought. I became like, I was nihilistic, and then I was like, why am I here? Because I stopped believing in heaven, I stopped believing in hell. I believed in God to some extent, but in a very horrible depiction of God, one that Christians wouldn't resonate with at all. Just very like, I used to believe that God loves to, torture people and make them, play mind games with them and all this stuff, because that's what I felt like I was going through. And so within that kind of whole experience, I realized like I was searching for a relationship with God for the sake of a relationship with God. Because I stopped caring about heaven and hell, because at the time I didn't believe in it. And I wasn't into the idea of like, oh, I'm going to have this relationship with God to fix my life, because that's what everyone sold me. I got very tired of everyone saying, oh, you're broke, get some Jesus. You sad, get some Jesus. And I'm just like, I just want to know why to care, because like I know that people search for money, freedom, power, all these things in different places and choose to be fine with those. So it's not like this is an isolated thing to Christianity. Not saying that like it's equal, if you're trying to find joy in drugs, that's probably not the best place to go. But I think for me, what was freeing was choosing to, after finding the right people to ask the right questions to, love God for the sake of loving God, and accept that I don't have a reason why beyond that. Kind of like if someone were to ask me, why do I love Josh? I wouldn't list out a thing of like great characteristics that he has. I just say he's Josh. Because once I attach my love to him because of the characteristics, if those characteristics were to go away or change, then my love would go away or it would change. So it's kind of been, I don't know, my experience.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Because that would be hard if like, so why do you love God? And it's like, well, because he's faithful and he answers prayer. Well, what happens when it seems like he doesn't?
Yeah.
And then, I don't know, you kind of...
That was, and I think I found out that was why, when I started, or I guess, before, my whole falling away from Christianity, a very, very just difficult situations came up in my life. And I was like, God, why aren't you answering this prayer? Why aren't you fixing this thing? And I'm like, don't you love me? Don't you care? And just growing up, people saying oh, you have favor from God when he does this or does that. Or if you have enough faith, God's going to move. And either it being all on me to make God do something I want, or it being all on God to kind of be like, I don't know, to kind of decide. And so I was just like, well, if God doesn't answer prayers and he doesn't, because usually it's in the way that I want them to be answered, then I was just like, then God doesn't care, which I've, no longer feel that way, but that's how I felt for a while.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, this, I think a lot of people look at prayer as more of this magical thing, where you can change the events around you through prayer. And my uncle once told me, Because the prayer was a big question for me. Like, I don't think at the time I would have said, like, if there is a God, God just doesn't answer prayer. Um, Things just happen. People get sick. Some of them die. Some of them survive. They were all praying. The one person loses their keys and can't find them. The other person finds them. They were both praying that God will help them find their keys. Like, life just happens. And he said, that, he doesn't think prayer is something that we do to move God and to change the events around us. Prayer is something that we do to allow God to move us in order to handle the events around us better. So for example, like if you have a loved one who's going to die, even though we're praying like, God, please, heal my loved one or whatever, prayer is less about changing the outcome of the events and more about changing the outcome of me and how I deal with those events. And I'm not sure if, a lot of Christians view prayer that way, but it meant a lot to me and helps me connect. It helps me like lean into faith while still feeling that way about prayer. I feel like prayer doesn't change events. It just doesn't work. Not the way we were told it worked. It works. I was always told, well, you're just not believing enough, or you're not having enough faith, or you're not being obedient enough, or something like that. God's just not pleased enough with you to answer your prayers, or, you're not in the will of God. Like, if God's will is what it is, then what's it matter if I'm praying? Like, if God's will is going to happen, then how is my prayer influencing anything? If my prayer has to line up with God's will, then all I'm doing is accepting God's will. Like, I'm not changing anything by aligning my prayer with God's will. I'm just accepting how things are. But yeah, I think I'm kind of losing my train of thought here, but I think people's understanding of prayer kind of gets back to that thing of certainty. If I can follow these steps, I will get this outcome. And it doesn't work out that way a lot of times. Often it doesn't work out that way. And so what do you do then when it doesn't work out that way? If you've been told, if you do these things, if you don't date before you get married, and you don't sleep around before you get married, you wait until marriage, then your marriage is going to be perfect and wonderful, and your kids are going to be in church, and it just doesn't work out that way all the time. You can follow all the right rules and it just doesn't work out. So what do you do when your prayers don't get answered? And I think if we're banking on certainty, that just really starts to fall apart.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think that's a fair point. I think it's probably why my faith fell apart back then, because I was banking on God to just answer my prayers exactly how I sent them. Just like, I want X, Y, and Z to happen. If X, Y, and Z doesn't happen, I'll be mad. And I think shifting my perspective to, I don't know why certain stuff happens. Like, I'd assume if someone got sick, it's because they caught something, but like, I don't know why they in particular, why it had to happen to them. And I've kind of accepted that there is a lot of uncertainty to why certain things happen, and learning that, okay, like, what God is going to do in that situation is help give me peace, because I feel like that's a very wholesome thing, and help change my heart. Maybe I have bitterness to someone, or maybe I'm angry about something, or handling a problem in a very destructive way. I think God gives us the tools to be able to, I guess, respond appropriately. Not that we do it perfectly, and not that we can immediately understand, oh, this is exactly what God is giving me. I don't know. I feel like an overarching, maybe I'm wrong, but an overarching thing that I've observed in our whole conversation is recognizing the uncertainty and kind of accepting that it's there. So it seems like once, because I'm someone who likes everything to be very clear in black and white. Like I want to know, okay, what steps do I need to follow? What rules do I need to, all of that stuff. And letting go of like, I don't know what tomorrow is going to look like, but I know God is going to be with me. And, like I feel like that is, as much as that scares me as someone who wants to know, like, okay, am I going to wake up tomorrow morning, or is my day going to be great? Or, are all these things going to happen the way I want it to happen? As much as that scares me, there's almost a sense of knowing that, like, if God's with me, it's all going to end up being okay, which isn't, very descriptive, but that's kind of where I'm at right now in my faith journey. Yeah.
Yeah, I think if the church allows room for the reality of things not always working out, and the doubt that's going to follow with that, the uncertainty, then I think they will help cultivate stronger faith.
Yeah.
I think, hanging on to certainty, viewing doubt as the enemy sort of feeds into that thinking of, if I pray the right prayer, or if I'm obedient in this, then things will work out. If I'm praying the right prayers, like things will work out the way I want it to. And then when that doesn't happen, it just falls apart. And so I think just being honest about that would, I think, provide people with a stronger faith, which I think is why people cling to certainty so strongly, is because they don't feel like the church that they'll still be safe and accepted if they express that doubt.
Yeah.
I think the church is the riskiest place to express doubt. They just really push back against it. And so that keeps people over here clinging to certainty and proclaiming certainty, shaming doubt almost. And it just ends up with this, a lot of times it just ends up with like this masquerade, this facade.
Kind of experienced that. Kind of seeing, I don't know, I'm just having a moment where I'm realizing I think everywhere I felt like as my faith was falling apart, feeling like I think everyone's making it up. I don't think that's true now, but at the time when I accepted, like, okay, it's absolutely normal to have questions. I'm not a crazy person for having questions or a crazy person for having doubts. Like, once I accepted that, I'm just like, how come no one else is asking these questions? And realizing, like, no, people do. They just keep it to themselves because they're scared of the answer that they get or might not get, or the repercussions.
Yeah, I read this book called The Call, and it's written by Mike Avery and Larry Smith from God's Bible School. I know they're CHM dudes, but it's really, really good. And there's a section in here, I'd have to flip through it to find it. I can't remember exactly what page it's on, but Avery talks about how his generation really like black and white thinking. They like rules. They like to know that if they follow these rules, everything's going to work out fine. And they don't mind burying their questions because certainty feels good. And he talks about how the younger generation, and at the time when he wrote this book, when he said younger generation, he was referring to like people my age. They're asking a lot of questions. And he talked about the importance of, this group who doesn't like questions. They like the rules, to understand that this is a necessary journey for people to go through, and that their questions aren't disrespectful, and it's not about running from God or not loving God. And that the older generation needs to understand this. And the reason why they call it The Call is because it's like they're calling out, the name of the book is called The Call, Essays to the Conservative Holiness Movement. And so he talks about a lot of ways that the conservative holiness movement has failed. And this is one of the ways that he points out is that they tend towards this very black and white thinking. They like to follow the rules. And they often view people with questions in a very shameful, condemning way. And so I was really, really thankful that there's a voice within the CHM encouraging people to ask questions and calling on the older generation, I guess, to make room for that and to not cast people out because of their questions. So I was thankful for that. But yeah, it's such an amazing book. I mean, if someone wanted to bash the CHM, this book is full of reasons. And I know that that is not at all Avery's intent or Larry Smith's intent. They are really trying to, they mention in here over and over again, some positive things about the CHM, how much they love the CHM. And they're really trying to call them in this very loving way to a much more healthy place. But they point out a ton of issues within the CHM. And so I would say, I would recommend anyone who has remained within the CHM to read that book. It's just really, really good.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like they're trying to promote some level of healing and growth within the CHM with that. And I think that's really good.
Yeah.
I think something that you said, that the church that you go to when it comes to the doubts you might have, I think that is a big deal. Because even now when we're at what I've found to be one of the best church experiences I've had, I still get questions. I have questions. And realizing that people around me that I ask questions to don't feel threatened, don't make me feel guilty for having questions. It's a big sigh of relief. And I think also knowing that, or at least for me, it's been the accepting of a relationship with God can happen even when you do have doubts, even when you do have questions. It might feel awkward or uncomfortable, but you can still pray. You can still say, "Hey God, I'm struggling. I love you, but I'm struggling." You can still say that, and knowing that I can do that has been so freeing, because I feel okay, I don't have to have my ducks in a row. I can still have doubts, still seek out answers, and still choose to love God. It's, I don't know, there's this almost feeling of I can grow slowly. Because the older I've gotten, the more I realize I barely know anything about Christianity, and recognizing that at first was scary, but then realizing there's so much time I have, and the intention of choosing to learn, choosing to ask good questions, because sometimes I feel a lot of doubts end up being very good questions that people have. And choosing to still worship God in the midst of that, choosing to praise God and pray to God in the midst of that, and engage in that relationship. I have found that to be super healing and wholesome. I can kind of hold both, basically.
Yeah, I feel we're reaching a pretty cool stopping point with the but this has been pretty cool. I
really enjoyed it.
I really enjoyed the conversation too. You're a very calm person to talk to. That actually surprised me.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah. Because normally I get maybe a little nervous recording these. You're very chill. Yeah. You're also, you did a good job at talking and doing a conversation. Yeah. I'm not very good. I'm young. So, I was an iPad kid growing up. So it wasn't, not really, but
we're not
really, but I'm really bad. I stop and I stutter and I,
Oh man, me too. I'm actually really bad at conversation. I'm just stumbling over my words and I tend to ramble.
Yeah.
But
I tend to ramble as well.
Rambling on podcasts is great. I'm really bad at that. So, I'm really bad with just pulling stuff out of thin air or making things up or elaborating off of a.
That's probably a good thing that you're not making things up, though.
I guess so, but it's not good for podcasts because you got to keep things going. You got to keep it snappy.
I think I tend to.
I struggle to maintain a coherent thought process.
Yeah.
I'll be talking about this thing and mention one little thing oh yeah, that reminds me of this, and I'll start talking about that, and then I'm over here again, and people are what are you talking about?
Yeah.
That's all of our conversations.
Yeah.
I'm very, I struggle to stay on topic, and then I'll start an idea. I'll know the idea that I'm trying to communicate, and then I'll get distracted by a secondary idea, completely lose train of thought, and I'm just like, what was I trying to say earlier?
It is cool though, because we were friends for a couple of years before we got married, and when we were friends, just having conversations, they stayed more on point a lot. But when we got married, we realized very quickly that they really didn't matter. If we got off topic, because we'll come back to that topic eventually, whether it be in an hour or tomorrow or something. But yeah. But this has been very cool.
Very good.
I want to ask you I want to ask you about your podcast a little bit.
Yeah.
But then I also wanted to ask you if you had closing thoughts. So I don't know what you wanted to talk about first, though.
Yeah, well, I'll mention the podcast first. I've only got a couple episodes out, but it's called My Journey Back to God, with a question mark at the end of to God. Because I'm not really sure what that means just yet, but it's a place where I hope to just talk about some of my questions and share my journey in a podcast format instead of ranting on Facebook all the time. And as far as closing thoughts, I would say, we've been talking about certainty and doubt, and I don't know if I would say that doubt is a good thing or that we should even lean into doubt. I'm not even sure if I would say doubt is necessary, but I do think doubt is inevitable. It's just we're going to doubt.
Yeah.
And I think what is necessary is to make room for that, especially the church. If the church makes room for that, then it lets us know that we're not alone in our doubt. Mm-hmm. If the church tries to cling to certainty and preach certainty, and you need to know that you know that you know, and we're left alone in our doubt. And I think that's when we really, really struggle. And when we end up in those really dark places of, wondering if there's any meaning to any of this and what's the purpose of staying around anymore. I've been there. And I think if we can make room for doubt, then we'll be able to be there for each other, not with answers necessarily, or not pulling each other back to certainty. It's kind of like when you lose a loved one. You need friends around you, not to bring the loved one back or to replace them, but to be there in your grief, to be there and share that pain. Doubt is extremely painful. This has been such a painful journey for me. And many people within the church have sort of checked out real early on in my journey. So I think what is necessary is that we make room for doubt, because it's going to happen.
That's really good. Yeah.
It's pretty good.
I don't really have anything to add to that, because I think I do, no, this isn't false praise or anything. I think that's really the best way to say it.
Yeah,
so,
I agree.
Yeah.
Thanks.